Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to be talking about higher education and whether or not we're headed for a collapse of some sort. We even have talked about a housing boom. What about a college bubble? Well, we'll talk about that today here on the program. But maybe to get your attention, let me ask you a question. Imagine if you were to go out and to buy a BMW every year. Now, again, we're being hypothetical here. Nobody's going to confuse my 12-year-old Olds Alero in the parking lot for a BMW, but stay with me for this. Imagine if you were to buy a BMW every single year, and then you drive it off the cliff, and then you buy another one and drive it off the cliff as well. Well, that's just one of the many arresting metaphors in this new book that illustrates that maybe there's a false promise of higher education. We bring back to the microphone Charles Sykes, who's been with us many times before. We've quoted him even when he hasn't been on the program, author of such books, A Nation of Victims, Dumbing Down Our Kids, one that we'll be quoting quite a bit today, Prof Scam, as well as, of course, this new book, Fail You, The False Promise of Higher Education. He has certainly been published in all sorts of very prestigious magazines and, of course, is the author of many books. Charles Sykes, welcome back to Point of View.
It's good to be back. Thank you very much.
You know, that BMW example, explain it a little bit more, because you use it early on in the book, and it certainly got my attention.
Well, it got my attention, too, because I had actually lived through all of this at a lot of private schools. It now costs more than $50,000 a year, in some schools $60,000 a year to send a son or daughter to school. So the analogy that I used was, just imagine going out and buying yourself an expensive luxury car and driving it off a cliff. If in fact you are you add up the full 4-year tuition, it's like buying a Lamborghini on credit. We've gotten to the point where a 4-year college education at some of these very, very pricey private schools is the equivalent of buying a house. Student loans can be the size of a mortgage.
Well, and again, I've put 3 kids through college, and I know exactly what that's like. I mean, you go in there in the financial aid office, and they tell you what you're going to have to pay, and I'm saying, I'm not here to endow a chair here in your university. I'm just trying to get my kids through school. So we recognize that, but at the same time, we've got a couple of other things unfolding. You early on in the book also talk about the fact that you have some of these liberal arts colleges that are essentially going bankrupt, and you have the possibility of a college bubble. Talk us through some of the various things that you've discovered as you begun looking at this area of higher education.
Well, there are a lot of parallels. They're not exact, but there's a lot of parallels between the higher education bubble and the housing bubble that we just experienced. And the key to it is the rising cost at a time when value is declining. People, bubbles are caused when people just simply assume that something is really, really valuable until they change their mind about it. So, for example, people were willing to go into massive amounts of debt to buy houses, bigger houses, more, fancier houses, on the assumption that house would always become more and more value. And the moment that housing began to lose its value, well, the entire pyramid collapsed. We all went through this. We all lived through this. So people are asking the question, I'm certainly exploring the idea of whether or not we're seeing the same thing in higher education. The problem in higher education is twofold. Number one, the costs have been exploding, dramatically faster than the rate of inflation, 4 times the rate of inflation. And so you have the cost problem, but at the same time, you have declining value. So there's a problem of cost and value. And by value, I mean 2 things. Number one, what is actually the payoff? Are you able to get a job? As you had been led to believe that this was the ticket for the middle class. You went to college, you paid whatever they charged because this was how you got a good paying job. Well, what happens if half of the recent college graduates either can't get jobs or have jobs that don't require a college education? So there's the economic value, and then I think there's the more fundamental issue, which is what have you actually learned? Mm-hmm. What is the intellectual content of that? I mean, it's one thing, to buy the BMW and drive it off a cliff every year if you are getting liberally educated with a small L, if you're learning how to think critically, if you're, in fact, doors open for, well-paying jobs. But once that stops happening, people begin to examine, why are we spending so much for so little? Why are so many students spending so much time, so much money at these institutions and coming away without particularly impressive educations or without impressive job prospects?
Well, and again, you probably have to have 3 books on your shelf if you really understand this, because we're going to be pulling from Dumbing Down Our Kids and Prof Scam. But let's talk about one aspect of that, because anybody that has read your book, Prof Scam, or even just seen a Wall Street editorial, or maybe some of the other commentaries I've written over the years, sometimes quoting from you, the reality is that if you go to a university today, you will not be taught by those professors with those wonderful credentials that are listed in the catalog. Most likely, you'll be taught by a TA, and there are professors at which you've documented in your previous book and in this book who actually are on campus that have never taught an undergraduate and actually would rather have a root canal, you say, than actually teach undergraduates. Tell us about that.
Well, this is something that the professoriate and the academics really hate. They're very, very sensitive about this because I think it's so true. But my first book, Prof Scam, was written back in 1988, and you probably know the story about it. My father,
yes, your father,
was a professor. He was a recovering journalist, and he talked to me about kind of what he saw as the scam of higher education, how seldom the professors taught what they spent their time doing. And he actually wrote an article for a magazine I was editing called The Sorcerers and the 7.5-Hour Week. The sorcerers referring to their research, but the 7.5-hour week was his teaching load. Well, what's ironic about that, of course, is that you would really have to look very, very hard to find a professor at a state university or research university that comes even close to that 7.5-hour teaching.
So if you get 3 hours, you're lucky, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so one of the themes of that book was the abdication of teaching, the bait and switch that you often had on university campuses, where students would be lured to prestigious, well-known professors, and yet when they got there, the only time they saw those professors was as a blur in the parking lot. So I talked about the flight from teaching, and symbolically, and the fact that you would go into the classes, as you mentioned, and often have the classes taught by teaching assistants, many of whom at that time could not speak understandable English. Now, that's not a rip on immigrant students. It's just a matter of communication. And I think it was a sign of how little they cared about teaching, that they not only encouraged professors to leave the classroom, spend as little time possible with students, but then they would turn over the teaching duties to other students who had no training whatsoever and were not very good teachers at all.
Yes.
And this was really at kind of the heart of Prof Scam back in 1988. And so this book really is kind of my way of looking back on it and saying, okay, first of all, deja vu all over again, but also it has gotten so much worse. So whatever I wrote about in Prof Scam has gotten dramatically worse throughout higher education as the teaching loads get lower and lower and lower to the point where schools actually negotiate with one another, not just on how much they pay professors, but how little they ask them to spend time with students. And I hope that students and parents understand that dynamic before they write out that tuition check.
In Chapter 2, Deja Vu, Prof Scam, 28 years later. It's worse than you might imagine. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Is abstinence education a failure? One would certainly think so, looking at some of the statistics being printed in various newspapers. But anyone willing to dig deeper will find that these statistics are sometimes misleading. First, let's look at the overall trend. During the 1970s and 80s, comprehensive sex education was being introduced into the schools. The proponents talked about condoms and so-called safe sex. What happened during that period? Well, teen sexual activity rose and pregnancy and abortion rates reached all-time highs. In the 1990s, abstinence groups began to present a different message. The Centers for Disease Control found that sexual activity rates of high school students declined and teen abortion rates dropped over 50%. Of course, it is possible to argue that this overall correlation may not be connected, so let's look more closely at some of the numbers used to argue that abstinence education does not work. Opponents of abstinence education nearly always refer to teen birth rates rather than teen pregnancy rates. What is missing in these comparisons are teen abortions, which mask the real impact of abstinence education. Let's compare two states of similar size, Texas and New York. The state of Texas has many more teen births than the state of New York. And opponents of abstinence education use this to show that that state that does not emphasize abstinence education, New York, is doing better than the state that does, Texas. But there's something missing from these comparisons, teen abortions. In New York, 56% of pregnant teens abort their babies, while only 16% of Texas teens do so. When you compare teen pregnancy rates rather than teen birth rates, you get a much more accurate picture. What you discover is that abstinence education is working. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us today Charles Sykes as we talk about his new book, Fail You, The False Promise of Higher Education. We have a link to his website, also to the book. It's published by St. Martin's Press. Probably can find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've made it very easy for you to order it on hardback or even to get it in Kindle. And at a time when student debt exceeds $1 trillion, are you ready with that? $1 trillion of student debt. You have to really begin to ask whether or not the students, and more importantly, their parents, are getting much of a bang for their buck. And this is why, again, it's important to think about this. Let me just open up the phones, too, as we go along. Our call's already coming in, so I might as well. 1-800-351-1212. I know some of you want to address this issue, and you are free to do so as we talk with Charles Sykes. But before we take some of those phone calls, let's get back to this idea, and especially you talk about in Chapter 3 of the escalating flight from teaching. Because as you pointed out, when you quoted from your father, 7.5 hours a week doesn't sound too demanding, but probably some of these professors, if they teach one class for 3 hours a week, that's about the whole teaching load. So it gets into the question that many people would ask. If they're not in the classroom teaching, what in the world are they doing?
Well, it is amazing the number of things that the universities think are more important than teaching in the classroom, and I think you see that very starkly in the workloads of the professors. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that professors don't do anything or that they don't work hard. My point is they're not available to students, and I try to look at this from the point of view of the student. But as I did in ProfScam, I do ask that question: where are they? What are they spending time doing? And of course, the answer is usually publishing research. Now, there is of course valuable research. Somebody's out there trying to cure cancer. But the dirty secret of academia, and everybody in academia knows it, is that much of what passes for academic research is unread and unreadable in thousands of journals that gather dust in shelves, written in the jargon that I've called prof speak. And again, there are measurements of this. How many times is an article cited? How many times is it actually read? And I think that what's happened is that academia has come up with excuses not to spend time in the classroom. And as I mentioned in both books, one of the tells here is that almost every school that I've ever visited, you'll find a story of someone who wins the Best Teacher of the Year award, and yet the next year is denied tenure or is laid off or is fired, because it's almost a black mark against you if you emphasize teaching too much, because that shows you're not a serious scholar. So as I did with my previous book, I go through the numbers of how little professors teach and how much that has escalated, and then go through some of the things that pass for academic research on campuses today.
Well, and again, you give us a list of some of the kind of titles of these. I'll just read one to give you how esoteric and almost impenetrable some of these are. Effect in Epistemology, Relationality, and Feminist Agency in Critical Discourse, Neuroscience, and Novels by Bambara, Morrison, and Silko. I don't have a clue as to what that means, and I also don't think it's going to advance the knowledge of this country or the Western civilization in any significant way. And you've got pages of examples of individuals that are doing research that is really questionable in terms of really advancing the kind of knowledge that is necessary, not to take away the kind of research that has been done in engineering and in science and medicine and those kinds of things, but a lot of it is just mumbo jumbo, and it's a way to justify getting tenure and getting pay raises, but it really isn't doing anything to, first of all, educate the students. Or even if you assume that you're just a research professor, isn't a whole lot to really advance our understanding of some of the critical issues of the 21st century.
Right. It's not anti-intellectual to point out that much of this is gibberish. And one of my favorite chapters to have written was about a study that somebody did who figured, that, okay, let's make up bogus articles. We'll have a computer generate stuff that just has random words put together that sound profound. Can we get them published? And sure enough, they did, which is something that I wish I would have seen when I wrote my first book, because you always suspect that some of this stuff is published without anybody understanding whether there was a single intelligent point being made here. And as it turns out, some of it is, in fact, just complete nonsense.
Let me also get one more point in, and that is you have a section there, what do students learn or they don't learn? And you and Mark Bauerlein and a number of others over the years have really talked about the dumbing down of students. And I think it's important to recognize that, again, I wouldn't mind paying that amount of money if at the end I felt that we were producing top quality, top-of-the-line student that will be able to compete in the 21st century. But frankly, some of these degrees aren't worth a whole lot either, are they?
Well, there have been a number of academic studies, as it turns out, documenting how poorly our students do, not just high school students, but also college graduates. How do our graduates match up with young people from around the world? And the answer is pretty badly. Other studies have tried to track what I would call value added. How much do you learn? How much do students learn in their first 2 years of college? And there have been a number of scholars who have documented that they can't find any indication that students are actually learning much of anything. And what's interesting is that you do have some academics, and I quote the former president of Harvard as admitting, the fact is that our curriculum is not really set up to teach any recognizable body of knowledge. It's not just that we don't teach the best that has been thought and written or the classics of Western civilization or philosophy. It's that you can go through college without having mastered any significant body of knowledge. So we've trashed the curriculum, we've lowered the standards, and as a result, you are seeing these measurements where people are going, okay, so you have driven the BMW off the cliff every single year, you have this bachelor's degree, but what does it actually represent? Does it actually represent skills? Can you write a coherent business letter? Do you know where you have a knowledge of the world? Do you have some sense of philosophical concepts? And one of the things about academia is that if you ask these questions of university presidents, you get some very shifty looks, because they know that certificate, that bachelor's degree does not necessarily represent any of those skills or knowledge.
Well, again, we're talking today about these very important issues, and if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And I might just mention that as you go through the book, you conclude that really you have too many students that are going to college that maybe should not, too many which end up dropping out without getting a degree. Then you have those who graduate, but they are actually saddled with a tremendous amount of debt. And, of course, if you really want to get to the bottom line, pretty simple, and that is a lot of them just aren't learning a great deal. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll start taking some phone calls. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And we certainly do encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. Here's where you can find out more about this new book, Fail You, The False Promise of Higher Education. Charles Sykes is the author, St. Martin's Press. And again, you probably will be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've made it very easy for you to get it as well. Just before we take a break, let me mention, as I did yesterday, that we sent out our email to you, and those of you that receive an email know that we have encouraged you to take an action item and to begin to act on it. Our action item up there is the issue of the internet, and we've talked about this yesterday, but let me remind you again that we have quite a bit of evidence now that indeed by the end of September or October 1st, however you want to look at it, we're going to see the control of the internet, which has been controlled by a American-based company, now actually moving to perhaps the United Nations, as a matter of fact, the United Nations International Telecommunication Union or something of that nature. This is of real concern, and we've talked about it before. The last couple of days, I've posted an article, for example, by Gordon Krovitz, which was in the Wall Street Journal, an internet giveaway to the United Nations. Yesterday, we quoted from Curtis Ellis, Obama plunges internet surrender to globalists. And again, if you would like more information about that, certainly that would be a great opportunity for you to learn from it. But we also encourage you to take some action. We already provided some of that in the email last night, but for those of you that don't get the email, I would encourage you to go to our website right now and go to our Take Action section. It's in the bottom section there, and click on that, and it gives you some information about how we will be giving up control of the internet and why this is of concern. We have some information about it that you can read that gives you a little more facts and figures on that. And then as you click that second Take Action item, we then go to a screen where we have a suggested letter that you can send to your 2 United States senators, and you're a member of Congress, and you can modify it how you want, put in your name and address there, and that's how it will know where to send those. And even if you don't know who your 2 senators and your member of the House of Representatives are, all you have to do is know your address, and the computer will figure that out for you, and then hit submit. This is a big issue, and so we really wanted you to take action on it. If you are convinced that we should not turn over the regulation of the internet to the United Nations or a similar kind of body, that's why we encourage you to take action today. It's all available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with Charles Sykes as we talk about his book, Fail You, The False Promise of Higher Education. All that coming up right after this.
You're in a room with 99 other people, 100 of you total. All of you listen to Point of View. You have that in common. What you don't have in common is that only one of you, actually less than 1 in 100, has ever supported the work of Point of View. That's what a recent study showed. 1 in 100, fewer than 1% have given, 99% have not. You listen, so I know you appreciate what this program provides. Now, I invite you to move from the big group to the little one. If 1/3, 33% of those listening, gives just $5 this week, we could fully fund Point of View for a year, 12 months. Not everyone will, not everyone can, but can you give $5 today, or maybe $55 or $105? Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send your gift to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Join the few, the thankful. Support Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. 15 different chapters. We've only covered some of them, but we'll try to do our best as we also take a number of phone calls, talking with Charles Sykes today about his book, Fail You, The False Promise of Higher Education, a book that I think you really would want to read, especially if you're thinking of sending a young person off to college, maybe a grandchild off to college, even that one chapter on the college for all delusion. It is quite possible that a young person does need to go to college, but there are a lot of other options. And when you are talking about $1 trillion in student debt, might be worth just reconsidering. And of course, we're going to be talking with some of our callers as well as our guest about this issue as well. So let's go first of all to Texas, KBJS. John, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, gentlemen, I've enjoyed the discussion.
What would you like to add to our conversation then?
I'm in the research business. I run an organization. We are contractors for different federal entities, so we interact with a lot of the research universities. And some of the real frustration that we experience is that the overhead that these research entities charge is up to 50% in some cases. So actually delivering something there's always a multiplier on top of it.
Wow.
Extremely inefficient and very frustrating for those of us who actually have to get something done. And of course, as you pointed out, a lot of times it's a research assistant or other players that are actually doing it instead of the people that are sold up front. And that, from our perspective, goes back to the business model and their motivation. We see it as at the universities, if you will, their business model has changed from producing the most competent and valuable graduate into simply keeping young people in the system as long as possible, and then they make the money very easy to borrow. So it's from a business side, it's very frustrating to see this cycle that we've created.
Wow.
And
good point.
And and our what we do is we make them compete against each other. And I've hurt some people's feelings when I go in and I say, guys, I know you're really good at what you do, but I don't care about your football team or how many degrees you offer. I want you to produce something, and this is what it will cost, and it is not an open end for you to study something to death.
Good stuff. Love to come to you, Charles, because, first of all, they bait and switch there, even when you're talking about working with a contractor for the government and the research institutions. But again, it does seem to me that the business model no longer is producing the best and brightest students, so are trained for the 21st century. The business model is how we can have the best stadium for our football team. You even have a chapter here on how you can have the best pool for Purdue University. So it does seem to me that the business model isn't really dedicated to doing what we've been told all these years universities are supposed to do.
Well, that is exactly right. And of course, if you really want to find out what's happening in higher education, you follow the money. And the reality is that what the caller was describing is in fact the business model and the priorities of the university. One of the reasons why they emphasize research is because that's where the money is. And getting federal money, being able to get contracts, that revenue source. And of course, the more lucrative those contracts are and more lucrative the grants are, the more they serve as a magnet for the professors to get out of the classroom. And by the way, people in academia will acknowledge this. I really respected Derek Bach, the former president of Harvard, who I quote in the book as saying, look, the reality is that most administrators get very few incentives to worry about student achievement because student learning can't be monetized. We don't make more money if students learn more money, if they learn more. He said, so basically, success in increasing student learning doesn't pay off for us. So we put our emphasis into raising money and getting grants to build new laboratories or libraries or Taj Mahal buildings. But the whole question of what is that student in the classroom learning, that's not really one of our priorities because that's not where the cash is for us.
Let me again come back to that I mentioned just a minute before we take our next phone call. I picked on Purdue University because that's chapter 8 where you got this kind of, like you said, Taj Mahal kind of situation, which you have this incredible aquatic complex, better than what you might see in some of the Olympics. Or you can go to Ohio State, and there they really do have kind of a Taj Mahal with kayaks and canoes and indoor batting cages and massages and ropes courses and things of that nature. And I'm picking on Ohio since we have listeners both in Indiana and Ohio. The president of Ohio State University even said, I readily admit I didn't think a lot about cost. I don't think we've really given significant thought to the impact of college costs on families. I appreciate his honesty, but I think it tells you a great deal about the mindset of a lot of universities today.
It was striking, particularly coming from that particular president who was making about $6 million a year in salary bonuses and benefits from Ohio State University at the time. And it is not a mystery why our college is so expensive. So one of the pieces of advice I would certainly give to parents looking for a school is if you go onto a campus and you see these absolutely gorgeous, palaces being, built, non-academic palaces, for the recreation center, the pools, the climbing walls, the 5-star dormitory rooms. One of the questions to ask is, who is paying for this? Who is paying for this? Because the answer is, did they put it on the credit card? Is the school deeply in debt because of it? So what I think you're having is a lot of the schools feel that they need to build all of these elaborate, bloated, structures in order to compete for students. This is one of the reasons why I think you're going to have a higher education bubble, because they're in an arms race. They're spending more money. They're borrowing more money. They're going deeply into debt. And if, in fact, the economy turns south or parents decide they're not going to be funding, the building with the 10 swimming pools, then a lot of these schools are going to face the possibility of having to close their doors or just going belly up. And this is already happening.
It certainly is. Let me take another phone call. We'll head out to Michigan. John, WLJN. John, you're on with Charles Sykes.
Thank you very much for taking my call, Kerby, and welcome back. And also, I wanted to ask Charles what I think is the big question that has to do with about everything that you're discussing, and feel free also, Kerby, to enter in. Charles, here's my question to you: what would be the implications of removing government from the field of education, getting government out of regulating it and out of funding it? The implications for both higher education and lower education. What would you give me for an answer on that? Because I'd like to interact with you a little bit if I could.
Well, it's an incredibly tempting prospect. Realistically, that's probably not going to happen. However, one of my critiques has been the way in which government aid, government regulations have contributed to so many of the problems. One of the reasons why colleges are so expensive is that every time government pumps free money into the system, that becomes a green light for the universities to spend more money. Many of the abuses that are going on college campuses about, microaggressions and trigger warnings and safe spaces are actually the result of heavy-handed, politically correct government regulations. So a lot of the things that we're talking about here have been driven by government policies and government initiatives. So I would look at it from a slightly other point of view, which is that government is not the solution to the problems that I am describing. Government has created many of those problems, and particularly when you look at the failure of the K-12 system, which I've also written about, the dumbing down of American education, that's also a real indictment of government monopoly education and what government monopoly education has done to the quality of education in this country.
Well, then also, what I'm thinking is that government, by virtue of it being a coercive organization by necessity and nature, it seems to me like government has a two-edged sword that it's using on us. One is that it's able to coerce us to get tax dollars to spread around to all levels of education. And then on the other flip side, or the other edge of that sword, is that government has the coercive power, therefore, to determine what is going to be indoctrinated in all those institutions that receive that tax dollar.
Sure. Let me put you on hold because we're coming to a break, and I'll keep you on, John, because I think you've put the point down. I'll give Charles a chance to think about that and interact. We have one of those mandatory breaks. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we continue our conversation with Charles Sykes. His book is entitled Fail You, The False Promise of Higher Education. And I think John made a good point, and that is it's the old golden rule. He who provides the gold makes the rules. And the coercive nature of government, both in higher education and even in the elementary and secondary education, are a good part of the problem, aren't they?
They're a very significant part of the problem, and I don't deal with this directly in this particular book, but I have been writing about and talking about the need for school choice, the incentives for homeschooling for many, many years. One of the things you need competition, you need decentralization. You cannot allow a centralized bureaucracy to dictate the content of the education, otherwise you get uniformity. The good news is that I think we're living in an age where new technologies open up new opportunities for different kinds of learning, and it's going to become harder and harder for people in government to control the access to this information, which doesn't mean that we're not dealing with a very significant problem of ideological indoctrination in higher education. One of the things that I note in this book, Fail You, and I devote several chapters to it, is the fact that I believe that the ideological environment on campuses has actually become worse, in part because of some of the initiatives of the Obama administration.
Yes.
But one of the things that's been happening is I think that a lot of conservatives have been opting out of academia. So the educational world is becoming more homogenous. It's becoming more uniformly left-wing. So these are very, very real concerns, and this ought to be very high on people's radar when they're choosing a school. If you're going to write out a big check, are you going to send your children to a school that is more interested in indoctrinating them and forcing them to conform than it is to teach them how to think?
Exactly. Yeah.
Any final comments, John? I'm going to go on, but I did want to give you a chance to make a final comment.
I wanted to ask Charles also if he could give us some idea. If we were to remove government, particularly funding, which would eliminate its influence pretty much, if we remove government funding from the education system, do you think, Charles, that all parents would be able to get their children halfway decent educated, at least to the level that they're getting now, which isn't all that great?
Well, over time, yes. I mean, I do think, and again, I don't think the government's ever going to get out of the education business altogether. It's too deeply ingrained. There's too much history, particularly with public universities. But I do think that higher education could be smaller, it could be more responsive, it could be more nimble, if, in fact, we did not look to the government to solve all the problems that we're talking about today.
Let's go back to the phones. We'll head to Georgia, WPWB. And Tanner, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Charles Sykes.
Thank you, Kerby and Charles. One of the things I noticed, my daughter's 16 and getting ready to go off to college, and we're trying to plan for that and such. We do currently homeschool. But one of the things that shocked me was the University of Georgia system is made up of 19 schools, of which only 5 have better than a 50% graduation rate. So what the point Charles made, that there's no incentive for students, there's no outcome-based measure for the schools to get the students out. And the government, basically, just like with the housing crisis, has pumped the educational system full of money, but with no outcome-based. What are the schools? They're incentivized, basically, to take these students' money. Oh, they didn't graduate. Well, but we still got their money plus a guarantee. So the problem is the cost has been directly driven upwards by that pool of money that's been thrust into the marketplace as every university competes for it. How do they compete for it? By building gyms and pools and all the exterior gloss things that a student and a parent might initially say, wow, look at this school, it's so good. But you have to look deeper. What is the graduation rate? What kind of programs are there to help students get through the school, to your point, with an education that provides critical thinking, that makes them ready to engage the world and hold down a job, not just in the place they think they want, but even to adapt to a changing world, because we've already seen in the last 20 years how much technology and other things have changed the way we even do business. So I think the whole problem really goes back, like you pointed out, I haven't read your book, but there's the mix between government money, government monopoly of education, which has deeply impacted K through 12. That's why we chose to homeschool, so that our kids really aren't getting the preparation they need to succeed. But the sad part is I don't see government getting out of it, and I already talked to some college professors go, well, how can you hold me accountable for whether a student does the work and the outcome side of it? But you know what? There's got to be a mix. We have to have that discussion and dialogue with schools to get to that end, because having kids go and spend 2 years and then have $40,000 worth of debt and no degree, that's just shameful, really.
Yeah, it's a disaster.
Well, you're right. You made a number of great points there, including the fact that we are setting up a lot of students for failure. You're not doing young people a failure, doing them any favors by giving them false expectations. So, for example, if you have schools where you have 50% dropout rate, you have to ask, what exactly are your admissions standards? Are you admitting students who are not capable? Also, those students who go to college and rack up debt and do not finish get what they call wage premium. They get no benefit. I mean, they are really, they have been disadvantaged by the system. And this goes back to this dumbing down of our educational standards at the K-12 level. And, you see this now reflected in colleges. I also get the same complaint that the caller mentioned from professors who will say, okay, one of the reasons why we don't teach much or kids aren't learning much is because so many of the students are coming now to college without the academic ability to do college-level work.
Yes.
And that really is a scandal. It's a scandal about the graduation standards of our high schools and of the admission standards. And the only explanation you can come up with for the admission standards is the universities are far more interested in enrolling warm tuition-paying bodies than they are in graduating educated young people.
So again, the book is entitled Fail You, The False Promise of Higher Education. We have a link so that you can find out more about the book. And again, it's published by St. Martin's Press. You'll probably be able to find it in your local bookstore. Also have a link to Charles Sykes of writewisconsin.com and all sorts of other links that would be helpful to you. And if you'd like to correspond with him, we have his both Twitter account and Facebook account there. So just all sorts of ways you can learn from him. And Charles Sykes, always great to have you on the program.
It has been my pleasure.
We would love to do that again sometime. But again, let's encourage you to find out more about the book, and you can do so by going to the website, pointofview.net. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, as you go to the website, there's also an action item for you. We've talked about it before, but let me mention it one more time. And that has to do with the fact that this administration, that is President Obama, is preparing to give away U.S. control of the Internet at the end of September, which means October 1st. It could be the United Nations International Telecommunication Union would actually have control. And that means that, countries like China and Russia, which have actually said this would be a good idea, might have the ability to have more control over the Internet. And if you have seen what has happened in some of these countries where they limit access, this should cause you some concern. You might say, well, then certainly Congress should act. Yes, they voted twice to block this, but the administration is pushing forward with this anyway. So we recommend that you contact your representative and your 2 senators and ask them to push their leadership to sue the administration to block this action. We've talked with a member of Congress about this, and it seems like that is the next step to take. And so we are giving you an opportunity today to express that opinion to your 2 senators and your representative. If you don't know who they are, the good news is as you click on these buttons, as long as you know your address, it will pop up the names and email addresses of your 2 senators and your representative. We have a suggested letter. You can modify it as you wish. You hit submit, and you've done your civic duty. But we are real concerned about this. You perhaps have already received an email from me last night if you're already on our email list. But whether you are or not, please go to our website, pointofview.net, click that Take Action button. And as we go to a break, that'd be a good time to do so. We're going to change topics in the second hour, and I think you will certainly appreciate that one too. We'll be back right after this.
There is a big incentive to pay your electric bill. If you don't, you find yourself in the dark. But who pays to make sure you're educated on the key issues of the day, to bring you wisdom for life at work, at home, and in the culture, like you hear from guests here on Point of View? Who makes sure that our electric bill gets paid? You're way ahead of me, aren't you? That's right. You do. The truth is, if every listener this week gave just $5, we could pay our bills for about the next 3 years. Did you hear me? $5, 3 years. Now, perhaps you can give more. How about $50 or $500, maybe even more? But please, don't be the one who fails to send at least $5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Whatever amount you chip in, thank you for your gift. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to ask a very fundamental question, and that is the church really helping us to be good neighbors? After all, we're supposed to love God and love our neighbors, but how well are we really doing at that? And I think this book is going to be a real challenge to you and to your church. So I hope you'll appreciate the conversation we're going to have today. And of course, we always give you a chance to join in on that conversation, 1-800-351-1212. The book's entitled The Neighboring Church, Getting Better at What Jesus Said Matters Most. And one of the co-authors is with us today, Brian Mavis. He, by the way, is the president of America's Kids Belong. Formerly was a pastor of community transformation at LifeBridge Christian Church, and has been involved in a number of things. Matter of fact, as I was reading his testimony, a lot of us benefit from Sermon Central, and he was involved in that as well. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. He's written curriculum for all sorts of different issues: Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, World Vision's Faith in Action, and The Hole in Our Gospel, and much more. But certainly we want to also focus on what we can do to be good neighbors and to really apply Christian principles in our community. So, Brian, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. It's great to be with you.
I've seen interviews with you about America's Kids Belong. So before we get into the book, I want to maybe have you speak to that for just a minute, because I know your goal is to really to end the crisis we have right now in foster care and adoption. And in some respects, that's a different topic than the neighboring church, but it fits under it very well. I'll talk about that, because it's an issue that maybe we could explore with you on a future interview, because there is a real need for us to apply these principles from the book to what's happening right now in adoption and foster care. True?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you about that. About 10 years ago, my wife and I had been foster parents, and we had a couple incidences that happened that really opened our eyes to the national scope of the crisis in foster care. And just one of those was, I was on staff at LifeBridge Christian Church, and we had a child welfare worker from Boulder County called and asked if she could meet with me to talk about child welfare in Boulder County. I said, sure, glad to do that. So a couple of days later, she came to the church, and the first thing she said to me was, thank you for meeting with me. I've been trying off and on for 3 years to meet with the church, and you're the first church to say, we'll meet with you. So I apologize that had been her experience with the church. And then she went on to explain that in the 26-year history of child welfare in Boulder County, there had never been one single day where kids were not waiting to be placed into a safe home, where kids weren't waiting for the grown-ups to step up and take care of them. And she said, I have a challenge for your church. She said, I'd like for you to help me change who waits. I want there to be so many grown-ups who care about these kids that they're the ones on the waiting list, not the kids. So I really felt like that was a challenge, not just from her, but from God. And within a year, we helped her achieve that goal along with some other churches, and then it just continued to grow throughout the state, our efforts, and now we're helping other states throughout the country. And there's 400,000 kids in foster care. There's 100,000 kids who are essentially legal orphans, but there's over 300,000 churches, millions of Christians, and I think God is rousing the church to take care of these kids, and so I'm a part of that.
We'll probably spend more time talking about that in a future interview, but let me just mention that that's americaskidsbelong.org,
or AKB, and you can find out more about that. And of course, we have all sorts of links, and you'll learn a lot more about Brian. And of course, he's the co-author of this book, The Neighboring Church. And really, one of the things that I thought might be helpful is for you to share your testimony, because you kind of do that early on in the book. You, a 20-year-old, you began to really get involved, but early on, after you had developed the website, sermoncentral.com, even though you were really trying to provide things for the church, you and your wife really kind of said, we really don't even like the church that much. There are some sort of done with church, and that was kind of your experience for a while, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. We kind of found ourselves in that place where we were attending church, and for whatever reason, we were in a place where I hate to say this, but just felt like we weren't either getting anything out of it, nor were we contributing much to it. And so we stopped attending church for some time, but then after a while, we had young daughters, felt like this isn't right either. So there was a new church that had started only blocks from where we lived, and it was growing fast, and it was kind of the hip church to be a part of. And so, we're familiar with that culture, so we started attending the church and felt, fairly positive about it, especially for our daughters. And after some time, we'd, been neighbors with, this is in Southern California, been neighbors with our neighbors for 4 or 5 years, and we had good relationships with them, and we felt like, let's invite them to attend church with us. And we, in spite of what the statistics tell you, all we got were no's.
Yeah. We're normally told that 2 out of every 3 individuals you invite to church usually say yes, but that wasn't exactly happening in California. Tell us why.
No, that every third person lived right by us. So but they made it clear. They said we're not interested in attending the church. We don't care how cool you think it is, how great the music is, but that doesn't mean we don't care about God and knowing more about God. And we trust you, and we'd like to learn more about God. So we had a few neighbors come over and essentially, started a house church in a sense. And we learned a lesson right there that even though some of the churches, a lot of churches are great and do great on the weekend worship service, that the neighbors that we had, that's not what they were compelled by. What they were compelled by was authenticity and being neighbors. And that was something that happened a couple of years earlier where my wife and I, since we weren't attending church, were saying, how are we any different than our neighbors? When we're gone, they take out our trash, and same we do with them. And when it's Christmas time, we give them cookies, and they give us better cookies. So we really made an effort to try to be the best neighbors we could be, and that led to that. But I did forget that lesson when we moved to Colorado, and it was reminded by it again by God. I was on staff at a large church, and this church really did make a focus on trying to be the best church for the community. Wanted to be a church that if it disappeared, that the community would care. So we worked hard at that. And we got a phone call, from the city of Longmont asking for our help. They said, we have a house that is a problem, and the yard is out of control, and we've sent multiple letters. Nothing's happening. If we try to take care of it, it's going to be really costly. Would your church consider taking care of this lawn? So I said, sure, I'll look into it. So they gave me the address. I drove there, and sure enough, the grass was like 5 feet tall. I knocked on the door, and this lady opened the door. She knew I was coming. I had called before, and there was a little 9-year-old girl next to her, and this woman who was about 30 just started crying.
Well, let me jump in because we have one of those mandatory breaks. I hate to have a cliffhanger, but we have to. We'll come back and finish that story as we continue our conversation with Brian Mavis about this new book, The Neighboring Church, Getting Better at What Jesus Said Matters Most. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Is abstinence education a failure? One would certainly think so, looking at some of the statistics being printed in various newspapers. But anyone willing to dig deeper will find that these statistics are sometimes misleading. First, let's look at the overall trend. During the 1970s and 80s, comprehensive sex education was being introduced into the schools. The proponents talked about condoms and so-called safe sex. What happened during that period? Well, teen sexual activity rose and pregnancy and abortion rates reached all-time highs. In the 1990s, abstinence groups began to present a different message. The Centers for Disease Control found that sexual activity rates of high school students declined and teen abortion rates dropped over 50%. Of course, it is possible to argue that this overall correlation may not be connected, so let's look more closely at some of the numbers used to argue that abstinence education does not work. Opponents of abstinence education nearly always refer to teen birth rates rather than teen pregnancy rates. What is missing in these comparisons are teen abortions, which mask the real impact of abstinence education. Let's compare two states of similar size, Texas and New York. The state of Texas has many more teen births than the state of New York. And opponents of abstinence education use this to show that that state that does not emphasize abstinence education, New York, is doing better than the state that does, Texas. But there's something missing from these comparisons, teen abortions. In New York, 56% of pregnant teens abort their babies, while only 16% of Texas teens do so. When you compare teen pregnancy rates rather than teen birth rates, you get a much more accurate picture. What you discover is that abstinence education is working. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Brian Mavis. He is the co-author of the book, The Neighboring Church, Getting Better at What Jesus Said Matters Most, published by Thomas Nelson. We have information about it. You can perhaps find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have it there, and it's written in cooperation with the Next Leadership Network. We'll talk more about it in just a minute. But, Brian, you're telling a story coming to this home in Longmont, Colorado. The grass is real high. You come to the door. Tell us the rest of the story.
Yeah, so the city asked to help out with this house. I knock on the door. This 30-year-old woman answers the door, and she starts crying and apologizes that her yard looks like it does. And she explains that she has stage 4 cancer and has been in the hospital, and that trying to take care of her yard would kill her. So I said, don't worry, we will take care of this. So I called the usual suspects at our church who always volunteer for stuff. They came out with their weed whackers and lawnmowers. In a few hours, we took care of it. We prayed with her. And over the next year, I called her a couple of times just to see how she was doing. And on the second phone call that I made to her, which was probably 9 months out, I was patting myself on the back for our church being responsive to this, and the Holy Spirit grabbed my arm, in a sense, and twisted it and said, quit patting yourself on the back. This should have never happened. The reason your church had to come and take care of this woman's yard at this point is because it failed to love her as a neighbor, and that the grass should have never gotten, no more than 6 inches high, because the neighbors who lived around here would have known that she was sick, and they would have taken care of her. And so I just started thinking, we maybe had a church with a lot of great people who were great volunteers, but we still hadn't succeeded at doing what Jesus said mattered most, and that was loving God and then expressing that love by loving people right next to us.
Wonderful story. You know, one of the things that you talk about early on in the book is a quote that comes from Richard Halverson. And of course, he was the U.S. chaplain in the United States Senate. And it's a great quote. I'd like to use it in one of my commentaries, but he had said that the church began as a fellowship of men and women centered on Jesus Christ. Then it went to Greece and became a philosophy. Then it went to Rome and became an institution. It went to Europe and became a culture. And it came to America and became an enterprise. That says a lot, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. And when I first heard that quote years ago, it hit me like I got punched in the stomach.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like that maybe we had Americanized the church too much, and especially in treating the church as a business, when instead it needed to be back a community of people following hard after Jesus and loving our neighbors.
Well, and again, one of the problems we have is we do have the institutional church, but help us understand what a neighboring church would be looking like compared to the institutional church that we have today in America.
Yeah, we're not against the institutional church. It's and what we're trying to do, though, is, in a sense, put this yeast into the dough of this institutional church that says, you know what? As a church, we focus a lot on trying to have, excellence on that Sunday morning, relevant preaching. Of course, we're good with that, and excellence in worship music. But we only can be good at a few things. So we thought, let's focus on what Jesus said mattered most. And we had no classes on how to be a good neighbor. It was like, this is ironic that the thing that Jesus emphasized, we don't pay much attention to. And I think we just assume that we're good neighbors. And so we said, let's really try to mobilize our people to be the best neighbors they can be. And the conviction that really came for us, though, was a challenge to say, imagine, and this came from our friend Dave Runyon and Jay Pathak, do a tic-tac-toe board and put your name and your household in the center box. Mm-hmm. Now imagine the 8 nearest geographically closest neighbors, and then write down the names of everybody that lives in that household. And when you try doing that, most people fail miserably at trying to fill that out. They might get a person here, a person there, maybe fill out 1 or 2 households, but for the most part, they fail. And so that was when the people realized, okay, I must not be loving my neighbors because I don't even know their names.
Don't even know their names, yeah.
I can't even pray for them. And so it was that conviction to say, I don't think we're doing as well as we think we are.
That is so well said. Early on in your book, you also talk about nuns and duns, and we've talked about the nuns before, those that are in really one of the fastest growing demographic groups in the millennials, those that basically say none of the above, atheist, agnostic, or no preference. But I wanted to focus a little bit more on the duns because you and your wife sort of fit into that category, and we've talked about that before with a couple of our guests. These are individuals who are Christians. Even in the survey that Pro Ministries did with Barna, they found that there was a percentage of those who had a born-again experience and had a Christian worldview, but weren't attending church on a regular basis. And so there are those individuals out there that have left the church because they have been frustrated about the fact, as you pointed out just a minute ago, that you felt that I'm not getting anything out of the church, nor am I contributing anything to the church. Explain that phenomenon, since you've been through it both experientially and as well as in terms of some of your research.
Yeah, it's this research actually comes out of a sociologist in Colorado named Josh Packard, and he wrote a book called Church Refugees.
Right.
And where it's being discovered that, as you said, in addition to the nuns, there's now this category of duns, D-O-N-E, and they are people who are saying they're devout Christians. In fact, they've probably been very involved in the church in the past, but now are in a place where they're not as involved, and they feel like in order for their faith to keep from eroding or in order for their faith to keep growing, they need to separate from the institutional church they're a part of, that 501c3 organization, in order to kind of save their faith. And it is one of the fastest growing demographics in the United States. And again, part of it might be as a result of the professionalization, turning the church into an enterprise, and people feeling like, I really don't have a place to contribute because I'm not a professional minister. And so one of the advantages of being a neighboring church is saying, hey, everyone qualifies. You may not qualify to teach. Maybe you're not qualified to be in the nursery or help with the Lord's Supper, but everyone can be a neighbor. Virtually everyone is a neighbor, and it's profoundly comprehensive because everyone can be a part of it, and you can reach all sorts of people in every demographic.
So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more, especially about this idea that you talk about sometimes, and we certainly have talked about, the church gathered and the church scattered, and what does that mean, and what does that mean to be a good neighbor, and is being a good neighbor just better than a good program, and what does it mean to really be a neighbor in the first sense? So that certainly is part of the conversation we're going to have in just a minute with Brian Mavis. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. You may just want to sit back and take some notes and even get a copy of the book, but if you'd like to join the conversation, that is a possibility as well. The book is entitled The Neighboring Church, Getting Better at What Jesus Said Matters Most. It is part of the Next Leadership Network. It's written in cooperation with them, and you can certainly look for it in your local bookstore. It is published by Thomas Nelson. And if you're concerned about maybe where your church is going, and maybe you're even thinking about starting a church, maybe you're in church leadership and really want to learn a little bit more about what this might mean, I certainly do commend the book to you as well. Just before we take a break, though, one of the other action items that we have for you is to go to our website, pointofview.net, click on the Take Action button, and what we're asking you to do, which I talked about yesterday and even sent an email out to those of you that received an email last night, is the concern that we have by the end of September that the United States will give away control of the Internet. This is not a good idea. And it is interesting that even though Congress has voted twice to block this, the administration's going ahead with it, which means on October 1st, quite likely it would transfer the control of the Internet to the United Nations International Telecommunication Union. Now, there's some countries think this is a good idea, and I yesterday quoted from some of them, like China and Russia. That cannot make you feel good about this. And so this is why we are asking you to contact your 2 United States senators and your representative. And you can do that simply by going to the website, pointofview.net. It's in the middle section at the bottom there. It says Take Action. As you click on there, we give you some more information about this, which you can read. And then once you click the Take Action button, it will take you to a page where as you put your name and address down, it will actually populate your 2 senators and your representative and give you a chance then to look at the sample letter that we have given to you, and you can modify it how you wish, and then click that Submit button and send it off. We really do believe this is an important issue. We've talked about it yesterday. I sent an email about it last night, and you can respond to the email, but if you don't have that email, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. Express your opinion to your 2 senators and your representative, and you've done your civic duty. We'll come back and continue our conversation with Brian Mavis, the neighboring church. All that coming up right after this.
Imagine you're in a room with 99 other people, 100 of you total. All of you listen to Point of View. You have that in common. What you don't have in common is that only one of you, actually less than 1 in 100, has ever supported the work of Point of View. That's what a recent study showed. 1 in 100, fewer than 1% have given, 99% have not. You listen, so I know you appreciate what this program provides. Now, I invite you to move from the big group to the little one. If 1/3, 33% of those listening gives just $5 this week, we could fully fund Point of View for a year, 12 months. Not everyone will, not everyone can, but can you give $5 today, or maybe $55 or $105? Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send your gift to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Join the few, the thankful. Support Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continuing our conversation today with Brian Mavis as we talk about his book, The Neighboring Church, Getting Better at What Jesus Said Matters Most. We also have a link to theneighboringchurch.com for more information. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or else feel free to sit back and take some notes and consider what you might do to change the direction of your church and to be a better neighbor and to love not only God, but to love our neighbors. Talk, if you would, for just a minute, Brian, about the difference between the church gathered and the church scattered. I think today in North America, we've really emphasized kind of this church gathered. In other words, if we build it, they will come. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that is not the case, and that's why we can't just always assume people are going to come to church. We're going to have to figure out how to go to them. Explain, if you might.
Yeah, you said it well. With if we will build it, they will come, and that works for about maybe 15-16% of the population. And so we're leaving behind about 85% of the population with that approach. And so, if to use a football analogy, if the church and kingdom were football, the gathering is the huddle, and the scattering is actually going out and executing the plays. And so, an interesting sample that happened, not in this country, but in Indonesia. Indonesia allows its constitution for religious freedom, and Christianity and Muslim missionaries entered in Indonesia about at the same time, around 125 years ago. And Christians did good things, built schools and medical clinics and churches, but they did it inside the walls. They had that compound mentality, that gathered mentality, and Muslims just went out into the neighborhood and had a part of the fabric of the community. And today, Indonesia is 86% Muslim, and so it's really the scattering that is effective. There's this lot of talk about being a missional church, and that conversation has gotten pretty academic. We believe that Jesus' way of teaching us to be missional was to tell us to love our neighbors. I don't know why. I've got some music going on here, and I don't know why.
It's all right. That happens sometimes. Live radio.
I don't. I'm borrowing someone's office. So anyway, Jesus' way of teaching us to be missional was to love our neighbors, to treat our neighborhood as our mission field, and so that's how we're trying to do it. Is to say, churches are caring more about their city. And we did have asked the question, if your church disappeared, would your neighborhood care? Would your community care? And now we're just trying to personalize it and say, if you disappeared from would your neighborhood care? Would your neighbors care if you left?
Yes. And I think that's important because early on in the book you do talk about that, and later on you come back to it. If the church disappeared, would anyone care? Would the community care? But what you're trying to do is move from the corporate body of the church, the institution, the buildings, to the individuals. And that is, if you left the neighborhood, if I can change that a little bit, if you disappeared, if you moved away, and you've moved from California to Colorado, for example, or if any of our listeners move from wherever they happen to be in California, Georgia, Michigan, Indiana, wherever they might happen to be at the moment, would your neighborhood even know that you left? And that's the frustration I have, because I really have kind of taken some of this to heart when we've used that tic-tac-toe and say, well, actually, I do know the neighbors on both sides of us, and they sort of communicate with us. But as new neighbors come into the area, we give them cookies, or we introduce ourselves, we give them our name and address, and we're lucky if we can get the door open, which is obviously one of the great challenges. But you have said that we need to maybe develop, even in our church, a Christ-like way of living, to know their names, their history, their hopes, to be praying for those neighbors, to helping single parents raise their kids, to consoling others when we suffer losses. that is a challenge in this 21st century North American culture where very few people sit on the porches at their front door, very few people walk in their neighborhoods, and even fewer people knock on the doors of their neighbors. So you really have to be very intentional, don't you?
You do. Yeah, you can't love by accident and live this way by accident. It's just, you're going against, this is a countercultural move to be neighborly again. It was something probably our grandparents took for granted, but we can't today. And really, for me, we developed 4 practices that have helped us and helped our people just be more intentional neighbors. And this actually came from an exercise I developed to try to be a better dad. When my daughters were young, I thought I'd be a better dad than I was. So I thought I need to be more intentional about being a dad. So I came up with 3 practices, and then my youngest daughter helped me develop a 4th. And I thought, I'm just going to put it in a way that's simple. It's going to rhyme, so I'll remember it and do it. So the first practice was just stay. I need to stay connected to my kids. I need to know what's going on in their lives, who their friends are, those kinds of things. And so that was the first practice, stay interested in their lives. The second one was to pray, that by being connected in their lives, staying interested in knowing what was going on, I could pray wisely, intelligently, and specifically for them. The third practice was just to say I love you every day to them, to say what it meant to be in our family, what our values were. And then when my youngest daughter was about 5 and I was just doing these first 3, she said to me, "Daddy, my favorite of you is when you're silly." And I realized I forgot a 4th one, and that was play, the serious business of play. And so I thought, this all applies to our neighbors too. We need to, as Christians, stay connected to them, be more interested be interested in them more than we're trying to be interesting to them, and to learn their names and hopes and histories and hurts. And then we need to, as we get to know their names and their lives, to pray for them and to even pray for ourselves that we'll want to love our neighbors. And then it's to play with them. And the way adults do it, and the way our model from Jesus, who was either going to a meal or at a meal or coming from a meal, if you're reading through the book of Luke, is to practice hospitality and have people over for a phrase I heard was scruffy hospitality. Just keep it simple, hamburgers and hot dogs, things like that. And then lastly is to say, eventually, hopefully we're living lives that provoke questions, and people will ask us, they'll say, "There's something different about you. What is it that I maybe can't see, but I'm experiencing?" And we can give them the hope that we have in Christ.
So again, stay, and then pray, and then say, and then play. And I'd encourage our listeners to write some of that down and begin to think about how they can use that either as they raise their children or grandchildren, or how they are reaching out to people in their community. Is this like a program? Is it a church program, or is it just kind of the DNA of the church? How does this get implemented? I know that we have pastors and youth leaders. We have Sunday school teachers and others that listen to this program, and they're going, okay, this is a good idea. Is there a 2-step program or 12-step program? Is there a curriculum, or is this just something we have to model from the pulpit? How do we do this?
Well, that's one of the advantages of gathering, is you can't teach on this, and so I still believe in the power of preaching and opening up the scriptures to this issue. But absolutely, it's something that needs to be modeled. I would encourage the leaders of the church to start living it out and experiencing, maybe, and realizing that they're not as good neighbors as they maybe assumed they were. But it's definitely not a program, and I refer to it as an unprogram. And the reason I don't want it to be a program is because programs have a shelf life; they end, and people are always looking for the next new thing. And so, I was saying when writing this book, I didn't care about what's next. I wanted to know about what wasn't going to change. And this advice to love your neighbor is obviously not original. It's more than 2,000 years old, and dating back to even the Old Testament. And so it's not a program. We are trying to get into the DNA, just asking people. I mean, if like your listeners today, I would just say, I have a challenge for you. Try to pray for your neighbors by name. and you might realize how few of them you know, and then invite them over for a scruffy hospitality, something barbecue, and put your barbecue pit. I literally, this happened in my neighborhood last night. I didn't host it, but my neighbors across the street pulled out their pit from the backyard, put it in the front, and Paul pulled up lawn chairs and brought over some food and hung out for about 4 hours last night. So just pray for them and then invite them over for some scruffy hospitality.
Sounds good to me. Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to ask a question that was asked of Jesus. Who is my neighbor? And again, you can certainly learn more about this from the book, The Neighboring Church, Getting Better at What Jesus Said Matters Most. We'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we continue our conversation with Brian Mavis, co-author of the book, The Neighboring Church. And again, it is published by Thomas Nelson. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to theneighboringchurch.com so you can find out a little bit more. Who is my neighbor? It's a good question to ask. You also have a little chart and even a test to determine what kind of neighbor you are, whether you're Mr. Rogers in a neighborhood or whether you're Steve Urkel or Ned Flanders or Newman or whatever. But answer that question because, again, we need to begin to have a biblical perspective of who our neighbor is.
Yeah, you know, Jesus, when he says that the second greatest command, which is like the first, to love God, the second greatest command is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. He's quoting from Leviticus, what we now call Leviticus 19:18, and the context of that passage is to not so much to think of, well, I need to love my neighbor in the same kinds of way I love myself, but we need to love our neighbor who is like yourself. And so the context goes on to say in Leviticus 19 that the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. So in other words, that passage, Jesus is pointing out that those neighbors that you think are a mess, well, yeah, maybe they are, but you're a mess too. They're sinners, or you. And we're all made in the image of God. We're these amazing messes. And Jesus is saying you need to take out these blinders where, I'll speak for myself. I've been guilty of thinking because I'm a Christian, I'm the guy who's going to be the savior of my neighborhood. I've got my stuff together and my neighbors don't. And that perspective is flawed, obviously. I'm saved by grace, and all my neighbors are just as made in the image of God as I am, and to view them as in that way, to see them that they are with inherent worth, that God has given them gifts, and I like calling that out in my neighbors. That they're great at being a handyman or their yard work or baking and those kinds of things. So that's one of the things that I think Jesus is wanting to have us see. One of the objections, though, we get the most is people will say, my neighbors are the people I work with or the people I work out with, and so I really don't want to have time or need to do this to the people that live right next to me. And we say, yes, go ahead and be a neighbor to those you work with and work out with, but that does not exclude you. Does not give you, doesn't give you a chance to justify yourself to not love those who live next to you, because that challenge is that you have to live a consistent Christian life with those people who live right next to you.
That's right.
So I know we're on the right path because so many people want to resist it.
That's a good test of it. And speaking of tests, just before we run out of time, some people might say, okay, I know you're not saying this is a church program, and it's really got to be kind of the DNA, and it's got to be kind of the lifestyle, and we don't want to ever put it on the shelf and say, okay, what's the next program? But they're probably thinking, is there a way we can measure this? I mean, you're talking about the neighboring church. Can neighboring itself be actually measured in any significant way?
Great question. We wondered about that, too, and we learned a lesson from a missionary. There were some missionaries living in Afghanistan, had been there for years, and felt extremely discouraged because they felt like their whole time there they hadn't made any impact. And so a visiting missionary, I think from Saudi Arabia, encouraged them and said, what I'd like for you to do is notice every little thing and count it as a +1. Like, for example, you're walking in the market and someone looks you in the eye for the first time. Count that as a +1. You invite somebody over for tea and they accept that invitation. Count that as a +1. Even the invitation itself was a +1. And so we started doing that. We as a church used to do these, and still do, these huge projects, school or help out with a flood. And it was 1,000 people doing one thing. And now we have 1,000 people doing 1,000 +1s. And we've learned that the effort you put into that compared to the result that comes out of it is disproportionate. That you can, make an invitation for someone to come to your house, and then they visit for hours, and you learn about them. And the effort you went into that was hardly anything, and the results that came out, it could be profound. It could be eternally life-changing.
Let's, if we can, talk about what's available at the website, theneighboringchurch.com. Of course, I would encourage people to get a copy of the book. It's published by Thomas Nelson. But on the website, you've got a lot of resources here. You've got the book, The Gathering, blogs, resources. Just before we run out of time, talk about what people will find when they land on the website, theneighboringchurch.com.
Yeah, there's a bunch of free resources there and just more articles for people to learn about and just find some inspiration, but also some practical ideas there. So it's a great starting place for them to take the next step. And that's really our prayer, is that everybody would just say, God, help me take the next small step in loving my neighbor.
And again, you have a contact point. So if we have some people that are saying, well, okay, I'm a pastor, but I need a little more help with this. I need to talk to you, or I need to bounce some ideas off of you. I recognize that you have a full-time job at America's Kids Belong, but would you or your co-author be willing to answer some of those questions or respond to some of those phone calls or emails?
Absolutely. So if you want my email address, is that what you're asking for?
No, well, just to let them find it from the website there. And that I don't want to put you on the spot too much since it's a national program. You might be inundated, but it does seem like a good way to go. And I would also encourage people to go to America's Kids Belong. That's probably a future program we'll do with you because, again, the crisis right now in foster care and adoption, I'm just thrilled that you've been willing to step out on that issue as well. So thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. I've loved speaking with you.
Again, Brian Mavis is the co-author of the book of The Neighboring Church. And when it came across my desk, I thought, this is what we need to talk about, what it's really like to get involved in our neighborhood and to really be biblically committed. We say we are certainly committed to our community, but okay, the rubber meets the road when you actually ask people, can you name who is your next door neighbor, who's neighbor across the alleyway, who's maybe even a neighbor in the cul-de-sac down the road? And that's when people start looking at their shoes. And so that's why we thought this would be a really good program to get you motivated and concerned. Let's take a break, but just before we do so, you know the drill. That is, we have given you an action item. We sent out an email last night, and we have a box on that. We also have it under our Take Action section. So either by responding to the email or by going to the website pointofview.net, you can express to your 2 United States senators and your representative your concern about the fact that although the United States has been the agency that has provided control over the internet, that will actually end September 30th. And starting October 1st, the United Nations or some globalist organization like that will actually begin to control the internet. This is not a good idea, and this is why we are asking you to take action. And so if you would want to do so, we have it very easy for you to do. Go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll find the information there. Click on that button, and as long as you know your address, it will pop up your 2 United States senators and your representative. You can modify the letter however you want, and then hit submit, and it will send them off, and you've done your civic duty. So let me encourage you to do that, and it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
There is a big incentive to pay your electric bill. If you don't, you find yourself cold and in the dark. But who pays to make sure you're educated on the key issues of the day, to bring you wisdom for life at work, at home, and in the culture, like you hear from guests here on Point of View? Who makes sure that our electric bill gets paid? You're way ahead of me, aren't you? That's right. You do. The truth is, if every listener this week gave just $5, we could pay our bills for about the next 3 years. Did you hear me? $5, 3 years. Now, perhaps you can give more. How about $50 or $500, maybe even more? But please, don't be the one who fails to send at least $5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Whatever amount you chip in, thank you for your gift. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.